Greetings to all those joining us today. My name is Andrea Calle, Project Manager at the Instituto de Ciencia Política Hernán Chavarría Olózaga. I'm happy to welcome you all to this important discussion on the opportunities and risks of having a bilateral relationship with China, where we are going to approach it from an Australian perspective. For those who are new here, the Institute is an independent and non-partisan think tank dedicated to promoting liberal democracy and defending economic liberties here in Colombia. Today's event is a joint initiative between our institute and the Australian Embassy, a key strategic partner in the region. Together, we aim to explore the current geopolitical dynamics that affect both countries and their impact on the stability and security of our democracy. We are honored to have with us Dr. Benjamin Herscovitch, a research fellow in the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University, who will share valuable insights on the topic. He is an expert on Australia's China relations and China's statecraft. He was formerly an analyst and policy officer in the Department of Defense, specializing in China external policy and Australia's defense diplomacy. Welcome, Dr. Herscovitch.
Wonderful to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. To dive into the topic, Dr. Herscovitch, why do you, as an expert, consider it important to our countries to understand China's political, economic, and security interests, as well as the dynamics of its diplomatic relations?
So many different aspects to this. China looms so large in the world today. China is a key country shaping the international security environment, and it's a key actor on the international diplomatic stage, and of course is one of the most significant countries economically in the world today in terms of its broad and deep trading relationships with countries around the world, and with its role as a key provider of investment to countries around the globe, and also one of the key technology leaders in the world today. Chinese technology is taking a growing role in markets across the world, whether it's in EVs or whether it's in information communications technology infrastructure or in personal electronic devices. So the significant role that China plays globally means that none of us can afford to ignore Beijing and not understand the political and ideological and economic and security drivers of decision making in China. In terms of Australia specifically, we here in Australia need to have as deep a possible understanding of China because of its especially big importance for us. When it comes to Australia's prosperity, so much of that is being shaped by China. If you're talking about Australia's trade relationship, China is by a huge margin the most important trading partner for Australia. Something in the order of 36% of the total value of Australian goods in 2023 went to the Chinese market. But then, of course, also in security terms, China is shaping the security environment in which Australia operates, whether it's in terms of issues of foreign interference and domestic security in Australia, or when it comes to key regional security flashpoints like the dispute in the South China Sea, or the dispute in the East China Sea, or tensions over Taiwan. China is a key actor in all of that. And then also, and this is something that is relevant to many countries around the world, but particularly to Australia, there's a big social dimension to this. In Australia, something like 1.4 million Australians have Chinese heritage of some kind, and that's something like 5.5% of the Australian population. So the people-to-people connections between Australia and China are very significant and getting bigger as well. And that means that what happens in China, what happens in the bilateral relationship between Australia and China will have a significant impact on a large number of Australians who have personal ties to China. Now, that's obviously not going to be the same in all countries, but the Chinese diaspora around the world, or Chinese diasporas plural, they are large and significant. And so that means that many countries will have those people-to-people ties as well, which mean that China, once again, cannot be ignored.
That's a very interesting view. Colombia has not a relationship with China as strong as Australia, but it is something that is growing every day in our country. And building on that idea, what are the opportunities and risks of trade and investment relationship with China in countries such as Colombia and Australia?
Yeah, this is a really important point. And I think the first thing to say off the top here is that The balance of opportunities and risks will depend on the country that you're talking about. It's not uniform and the same across the board. I think for a country like Australia, which is so proximate to China and which is so exposed to China in so many arenas, it's very possible that the risks are more significant than for other countries that are further afield, say, for example, in Central and South America. And part of the reason for that is that on some level, Beijing is going to be more sensitive when it comes to what the Australian government does because of our geographic proximity to China and because Australia is more of a significant player in China's immediate region. And as a result of that, China might be less sensitive than the actions of countries that are much further afield, geographically speaking. But I think, broadly speaking, we can say that there are both really significant opportunities associated with engagement with China and also really significant risks. And in some ways, those risks and those opportunities are two sides of the same coin. And I think Australia's experience over the last few years with China's campaign of economic coercion against Australia really highlights that from an Australian point of view, China is by a huge margin our most significant trading partner. So much of Australia's prosperity, our economic future, depends on deep and deepening trade engagement with China. But with that deep economic interdependence comes significant risks for Australia. And we've seen that since 2020, where in response to a political dispute, a diplomatic dispute between Canberra and Beijing, China started imposing a series of trade restrictions against lucrative Australian exporters. And this impacted a large number of really valuable Australian exporters, including exports like coal. That was worth billions and billions of dollars prior to China's trade restrictions. And the value of it was reduced to absolute zero at a certain point in the midst of that economic coercion campaign. And it impacted a whole host of different Australian exports. And I think what that experience highlights is that when you are deeply economically intertwined with China and you have a lot of economic exposure to China, there is the risk that the Chinese government will seek to use that economic connectivity as leverage and seek to punish you or seek to influence you to change your policy by using the threat or the reality of trade restrictions or other forms of economic coercion. Now, Australia is in the midst of persuading Beijing to remove the final trade restrictions. As we speak, there are still trade restrictions on some Australian red meat and on Australian live lobster going into the Chinese market. But for the most part, Australia has been able to weather the storm of China's economic coercion and persuade Beijing to relent with its trade restrictions. But it's still a very clear and, for many Australian exporters, painful lesson in the potential downside, the potential risks associated with deep economic interdependence with Beijing.
It's very interesting to note on your response how economic issues can have a significant impact in politics and how they can be used as a tool to manipulate internal issues in third states. In that context of what you just said, can you deepen in how has Australia managed diplomatic tensions with China? What diplomatic strategies have been effective in balancing the opportunities and risks in this relationship?
Yeah, look, this is a critically important question, and I'm glad that you asked it. And it's something that we debate a lot in Australia, trying to figure out what actually worked in getting Australia out of the grip of China's economic coercion. Now, on some level, one's assessment of what works and how to manage that tension will depend on one's political position. But I think there are some broad points that can be made that are probably generally cross-applicable regardless of the circumstances that a country is in. One thing that was really clear in being successful for Australia in managing this was not reversing policies to please China. So China imposed a range of economically coercive measures against Australia, in part in an effort to persuade Australia to change its policies on certain key issues. So there were things like in 2018, Australia excluded Chinese companies Huawei and ZTE from the rollout of Australia's 5G network infrastructure. And this was something that frustrated Beijing deeply. It was a point of enduring tension. And in part, China's economic coercion campaign was aimed at convincing the Australian government to shift course on those kinds of policies. And one thing that was really striking about Australia's response to China's economic coercion campaign was the policy continuity on both sides of politics. Neither the previous Conservative government or the current more progressive government reversed policy decisions to please Beijing. And I think that's important from the point of view of the principle of the thing, to not be willing to change your policy to please an actor that's being coercive towards you. But I think it's also important in terms of avoiding being caught in a dynamic where Beijing pushes you and uses coercive measures, and then you change policies, and then that incentivizes further pushing and further coercion. So I think the first thing is being willing to hold the line and to not roll back your policies to please Beijing. And I think part of the reason why China has removed its trade restrictions in the end is that Beijing realized that it wasn't getting what it wanted from Australia by having these coercive economic measures in place. There was limited incentive to continue with trade coercion because it wasn't getting the policy reversals it wanted. And therefore, Beijing had an added incentive to remove the trade restrictions and to try and repair the Australia-China relationship. But I think being consistent in your policies isn't the entire story. There are a few other aspects that have been key to Australia being able to navigate the tension in the Australia-China relationship and have the trade restrictions removed. One is a willingness to be a bit transactional and make compromises on some issues. So we had disputes in the WTO over China's duties on Australian wine and on Australian barley. And in both of those WTO disputes, Australia was willing to reach an agreement with Beijing to not pursue those disputes to their final conclusion. And that provided China with a bit of a face-saving mechanism. And that was something that was appreciated by the Chinese government. And there's also been a noteworthy pattern of cautious policy from the new Australian government that has presided over the repair of the Australia-China relationship and the removal of China's trade restrictions. Things like Confucius Institutes at Australian universities. There was the ability for the previous Australian government to remove them entirely, to veto them from Australian universities. The current Australian government has decided not to do that and instead is subjecting them to ongoing scrutiny. And I think that's the kind of decision where Beijing appreciates it, because you're not being, in Beijing's eyes, overly adversarial by totally getting rid of the institutes. You're just subjecting them to a bit of extra scrutiny, which I think is appreciated. So there are so many different ingredients to the current repair of the Australia-China relationship and China being willing to remove its trade restrictions. But I think three of the key ingredients are holding the line and not reversing policy course in response to economic coercion, being willing at times to be transactional and to compromise, and then also being willing to be a bit cautious with your policy and to not do things that might otherwise offend or frustrate Beijing.
That's very interesting, Dr. Herscovitch. In giving the perspective you've shared based on Australia's experience, what lessons could you offer Colombia on managing relations with China to maximize the economic benefits and minimize the risks?
Yeah, look, this is another fascinating and critically important question. I would say, as a preface to my response here, that I'm always reluctant to provide advice to other countries and other governments, just because so much of the nature of any country's relationship with China is going to be particular to their circumstances. And the circumstances of Australia are very different from the circumstances of Colombia when it comes to, say, for example, the nature of the economic relationship with China, the nature of our ties with both China and the United States and other major powers, and simple things like our geography. Australia much closer, Colombia much further away, and also the politics of our domestic political process in Australia versus yours in Colombia. So I'm cautious to offer concrete advice to any government when it comes to managing relations with China. I think on some level, all countries have to find their own path because it's going to be specific to their particular circumstances. Having said that, though, I think there are three general things which are going to be relevant to all countries when they're approaching their relationship with China. One is that, and this is kind of the overarching theme of our discussion today, that it's critical for all governments to approach the relationship with China eyes wide open to the risks associated with being deeply intertwined with China and dependent upon China for your prosperity or your technology or any other number of things. And part of that is noting that China, even though it is an immensely important economic, investment, technological infrastructure partner for countries around the globe, it's also a country which is liable to use coercive methods to pressure and to try and build influence and to try and shape policy in other countries. And every country, regardless of their size or their situation, has an interest in avoiding being coerced by foreign governments. You want to be able to shape your own policy according to your own priorities and your own national interest. And so I think any country that's deepening ties with China needs to go into that process of deepening the relationship aware of the fact that if you are developing a deep dependency on China, there's a possibility that the Chinese government will try and use that as leverage to pressure you and coerce you. That's the first thing. The second thing is that any government engaging with the Chinese government and developing deeper interdependence with China needs to think about the particulars of China's political sensitivities. China is an incredibly important, consequential, complex country with a deep and complex history. And the Chinese Communist Party, the political party that rules over China, has its own deep, complex history and its own set of political sensitivities. And understanding Chinese Communist Party ideology, understanding the Chinese government's view of its role in the world and the perceptions that it has as to how other countries ought to treat China, and also having an understanding of the domestic political drivers of policy in Beijing, the domestic sensitivities that the Chinese government faces, the importance that the Chinese Communist Party places on its own political power and rule in China. All those kinds of things matter deeply in understanding China today and what it will do in the future. And so I think the second thing is all countries need to understand that political context in China and the sensitivities that the Chinese government has. And then the third thing relates to what we were talking about just a moment ago in terms of a willingness to be a bit transactional and to be a bit cautious with your policy at times. I think when you're approaching a country like China, which is incredibly powerful, often quite sensitive and willing to use coercive measures to pressure other countries, you need to be willing to negotiate and be a bit transactional and to offer things up to Beijing that will appeal to China and placate China to a certain extent and keep China happy. But at the same time, you want to go into that process of being a bit transactional, knowing that you're not going to trade everything away. You want to be able to hold the line on some things and be firm with some issues and be really upfront with Beijing that certain things are not for negotiation. And I think if you're approaching China with those three things in mind, you're probably off to a good start in terms of managing a relationship which is both going to be incredibly complex and difficult to manage, but also incredibly important in terms of any country's security and prosperity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Herscovitch, for being with us today and for sharing your valuable insights and expertise on these matters. Your contributions have provided us with a deeper understanding of the complex issues we face in our region and in yours, and the importance of being aware of all the risks that came with having a strong relationship with China. We also want to extend our gratitude to the Australian Embassy for fostering this space and to all our attendees for your interest in the critical topic. We invite you to join us for the future events. We will have a monthly webinar with Australia experts for the next 4 months. We look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Until then, stay engaged with the Institute's work as we constantly analyze international and national political and economic issues that can affect national security, democracy, and the liberal economy. Goodbye to you all.